In this video, I want to talk about types of goods that we encounter in economics, and they're really sort of encapsulates all goods that are available either for sale or for transfer or provision by some actor, public or private. And the means by which we assess these kinds of goods are in terms of the degree of rivalry or non-rivalry, and the degree of excludability or non-excludability. And even though your texts discuss these, I want to sort of spend a little bit of time focusing on what they are, because the distinctions between these various types of goods that I'll be inserting on this matrix, which is a pretty common way, particularly in the social sciences, of laying out distinguishing characteristics. But what those characteristics are based in terms of rivalry and excludability. Rivalry simply refers to rivalry, perhaps unlike what we think of in economics, where we think of rivalry as being McDonald's going up against Burger King or Ford against GM. But in this case, it's not rivalry among sellers, it's rivalry among buyers. It's the degree to which one party can use a good at a given time and prevent others from using it. So if I buy an ice cream cone, for instance, that ice cream cone is mine, I don't have to share it with anyone else, and only one party gets to use it. And if it's a good that is non-perishable, such as a seat on an airplane, then only one party at a time can use it. So whether it's a car or a house, something that can be transferred to someone else being non-perishable, then it would be considered a rival. But if it's a good that needs to be shared, then it's considered to be non-rival. And if you're wondering what kinds of goods would I possibly share with others, as you'll see, there'll be a number of them. Now, one thing about rivalry and excludability, the term excludability sort of suggests rivalry when you think of it, because if I buy an ice cream cone, I prevented you from having that ice cream cone, and so therefore I've excluded you. But that's not what excludability means. In this context, excludable means the ability to prevent non-payers from using the good, and non-payers are excluded. So if I go to Dairy Queen to get an ice cream cone, and they say the price is $2, and I say I don't have $2, they will effectively exclude me from the use of the good. But if it's a good that they can't exclude me, then we say it's non-excludable. So this matrix, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is a pretty common methodology for laying out characteristics of items, particularly when we have a 2x2 sort of connection, but there could be other combinations as well. This matrix will sort of lay out the types of goods that we encounter throughout the economy, and we'll go a little bit further than what the text goes into in this context. Because the text really focuses on two kinds of goods, private goods and public goods. And let's talk about those first, and then we'll talk about some other kinds of goods which are sort of hybrids of those two extreme goods. Goods which are rival and excludable are what we simply refer to as private goods. And oftentimes, the way to think about a private good is it's produced typically by a private seller. These are goods that if I buy the good, and I have to buy it, because if I don't buy it, I'm excluded. But if I buy the good, it's mine for now, at least, as long as I am able to hold on to it. And as a result, no one else gets the use of that particular good. I buy a seat seat 21A on a flight from here to Dallas, then that's my seat for that particular time. If I don't pay for it, I'm excluded. And in terms of examples, I mean, the list is very, very long. In fact, the vast majority of goods in our economy are produced by private sellers who expect to be paid and who face a condition in which the buyers have rivalry amongst them. So as a result, the list goes on and on. I've gone through things like ice cream and airplane seats, but it's automobiles, clothing, you name it. The list goes on and on. So private goods really are most goods, particularly those produced by private sellers who have a particular profit objective. So that's one example. By the way, a lot of the examples everywhere in the text and in these videos tends to focus a lot on private goods. It's the way that we seem to understand economics better is by means of the motivation of private sellers and buyers, whoever the buyers are, public or private. Okay, what about goods which are non-rival, non-excludable? This is just the opposite, so as a result it goes in an opposite place here on the matrix. These are public goods. And the thing to know about public goods, just as is in the case of private goods, public implies the public sector, that is government provision or public sponsorship of the production of the good. Even though private contractors may be involved in the production of the good, still it's the government which assumes the responsibility for creating them. These goods are non-rival. That is, more than one can obtain the value or benefit of the good at a given time. So there is a nature of non-rivalry. I'm not competing with somebody to walk down the sidewalk, for instance. And I can't claim a portion of the sidewalk. It's a public property. It's a public good. And also, I'm not charged, so I can't be excluded because I didn't pay. Because I didn't pay to walk on the sidewalk, it's a non-excludable good. And here I'll get a little bit more specific with regard to public goods, because these do impact our lives, even though private goods do tend to predominate in terms of the total volume of goods that are produced. What are some examples of public goods? Well, anything involving public administration. This would involve things like all the alphabet soup of government agencies which administer our government, both at the federal, state, local level. It would also involve things like law enforcement. There is no private provision of law enforcement. That is, it's always a public entity which provides law enforcement, which doesn't mean that the occasionally overlapping responsibilities of public entities makes it somehow private. The Sheriff's Department is not really in competition with the state police, and the FBI is not really competing against the city police. So you get the idea. Law enforcement is simply a function of government. Also things like national defense, very clearly an example of a public good. And thinking about this in terms of rivalry and excludability, take something like national defense. These are goods that are non-rival. I am no more protected by our Army and Air Force and Navy than you are, and even if I didn't pay my taxes, I'm still as easily protected. So the payment of taxes is often brought up as being an explanation for why these goods are not non-excludable. But in fact, when you pay your taxes, you don't get to direct where those taxes go, typically. And even if you don't pay your taxes, you're still as protected as anyone else. And so the list goes on. Law enforcement, national defense, public education is often cited as an example of public good. Also things like public infrastructure. That is, the word infrastructure is a pretty broad term to denote things like roads, highways, freeways, rail in some cases also things like public utilities. It really depends upon the definition, but one thing you can say about infrastructure is it sort of connects the society together, and as a result, oftentimes it's provided as a public good, something like a highway. It'd be very rare for a highway to be a private good, that is a private entity producing a good and trying to charge people for it. I'm not saying it can't happen, I'm just saying it's less common. So these are two pretty starkly different kinds of goods. They differ completely in terms of rivalry and excludability. One is rival and excludable, the other is non-rival and non-excludable. And you couldn't get too much different in terms of the character of goods. These are goods that you can't stop people from using, regardless of whether they pay taxes or anything. Even regardless of whether they are even a citizen of the particular area. I see a fireworks display in another city, I get the benefit of it, even though I have nothing to do with that city, and certainly don't pay anything. So as a result, that good is non-excludable. And so now we come to these two hybrid conditions here, which are not really discussed in your text, maybe only in passing, and that is goods which are rival and non-excludable, and goods which are non-rival. Rival and non-excludable, and non-rival and excludable. So let's talk about this first one here, because this looks a lot like a public good in some cases, but it really is, in fact, has a lot of elements also of private goods, which is why that's sort of a hybrid. We say this is the output of natural monopolies. And for right now, we're going to be coming back to natural monopolies a bit later when we talk about market structure, but the output of natural monopolies is simply this. These are goods that provide a good which is producers which produce a good that's non-rival, and yet they're excludable, non-payers can be prevented. And there's a reason why we call them natural monopolies, and it has to do with the fact that the structure of the industry, particularly the cost structure, only really allows one producer. And the best example of this would be something like electric and gas utilities. Electric utilities, we could add to this water if you like, electric, gas, and water utilities. In most communities in America, there's only one provider of electricity, one provider of natural gas, one provider of water. And so think about this, if I go home tonight and turn my electricity on, I'm not locking anyone else out. I'm not preventing anyone from the use of electricity. We can all go home and turn our electricity on at the same time. We can all perhaps take a shower together at the same time. And as a result, there's no rival issue going on. But I've got to pay for that. So as a result, we say that this particular output has this particular characteristic. And we can also include, in some cases, things like local telephone service, which oftentimes is a monopoly, and we're not prevented from talking on the phone, all of us, at the same time. But if we don't pay, then we're excluded, so the good is excludable. And also, one thing that is often seen in many markets is cable TV tends to be an output of a natural monopoly. Usually one seller has the dominant market share. This is not to include satellite, which is really similar but different good in many ways. And so cable TV sort of fits that particular characteristic. Looks a lot like a private good. In fact, these are private companies that provide electric, gas, and water. And we're going to be coming back to them, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be coming back to them later and talking about what the regulatory impact is on these firms, because if you're the only electric provider, what's to prevent you from raising the price of your good? No one else has the ability to service those buyers, and we'll talk about how regulation prevents that sort of one-way movement of prices upward. Okay? And then the final one is goods which are rival and non-excludable, and these look something like public goods, and we simply call these common goods or sometimes common resources. These are goods which are rival in nature but are non-excludable. That is, only one buyer, or one user, we should say, of a good, because they're not for sale, can use a good at a given time, one at a time, but there's no way to prevent non-payers. In other words, free riders. Free ridership is an element of this. And some examples of this, and you'll see how government also sort of fits in, which sort of is the tie-in in this direction. The non-excludability characteristic sort of ties this into public goods. Let's think about some things that are perhaps a bit trivial, but are in fact examples of this type of good. Something like library books at a public library. If I check out a book, it's rival in the sense that I'm the only one using the book at a given time, and yet I didn't have to pay anything for that particular good. And so as a result, there's the free ridership element. And then when I bring the book back, someone else can have it, and it becomes rival to them. Also things like picnic tables at public parks. Picnic tables or campsites at public parks. You don't have to pay anything for the use of them, but if one family has a picnic table, it's rival in the sense that they prevented others from using it, so it becomes rival in nature. Also things like fish and game. And so now if the first two examples are a little bit trivial, maybe we're now starting to get a little bit less trivial. Fish and game. That is, if I shoot a deer, for instance, I'm the only person that has shot that deer. There's no aspect by which any other party can share in that. But it's also non-excludable. I didn't have to pay to shoot the deer. I just had to shoot the deer or catch the fish. And I know one particular point that's raised about that is, well, you had to either get a fishing license or a hunting license. That's true, but the hunting license or the fishing license is really a tax, and it's not the price of the good. Because think about this, if I get a fishing license and I catch no fish, I can't get a refund on my fishing license, because it's not the price of the good. It's simply a tax paid to government for the right to fish, and the same goes with hunting. And so any kind of payment to government really is effectively a tax, whether you renew your driver's license or get a hunting license, whatever the case might be. And then some other examples, as we sort of work upward here, in terms of what common goods might be. Things like timber and mineral rights, timber and minerals, which are very often on public land, and so there's the public aspect. And so if I'm a timber company and I want to harvest 1,000 acres of timber, I have exclusive access to that. In other words, the good is rival to me, but yet it's typically non-excludable. I'm not specifically paying for the timber necessarily. I may pay something to government, and government may get a piece of that we'll simply refer to as a tax. And the same goes with things like minerals. And when it comes to minerals, which is a very broad category of good, obviously, think about something like oil, and even take this outside of any kind of government control. Think about who has the right to oil underneath the Gulf of Mexico, out in international waters. Who owns that oil? Well, everyone and no one. And I think that's the thing we can say about common goods, is that the ownership accrues to everyone and no one. Who owns a library book, or picnic tables in a public park, or fish and game? Everyone and no one. And so as a result, it really has to do with the ability to get to the good, and the fact is it tends to be non-excludable in nature. And so the way of looking at these goods in terms of rivalry and excludability is really one way that it helps our understanding of how certain goods are delivered, whether there's an efficient way to deliver public goods, and considering the debate that we've had over healthcare for a long time, which really has more elements of private goods than public goods, the argument has very rarely shifted into whether or not healthcare, for instance, should be a public good, as it is in many societies around the world. And this is one way, one lens by which we can view these types of goods, and then assess, like we do many things in economics, whether or not they're efficiently delivering the most surplus to either or both sides of the market. So I hope this is helpful to you, and again, as always, feel free to contact me if you'd like to discuss individually.